Millions of voters are looking now at the U.S. economy during Trump's administration with rose-colored glasses. Inflation did decline a lot in 2020 due to the recession caused by the pandemic, but inflation will be about where it was in 2019 this year. Real GDP growth before the pandemic was unexceptional. In 2019, real GDP growth was at 2.5%, which is close to normal for the U.S. economy, irrespective of the political party in power. Real GDP growth was at 2.5% in 2023, same as 2019. There is one extremely important economic number that Republicans and Republican-leaning voters are ignoring when looking at the U.S. economy during Trump's administration. There were about 2.6 million job losses during Trump's 4 years in office. Let me repeat that, 2.67 million job losses during 4 years. That number comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It was the worst job record of any president since Herbert Hoover, who was president when the Great Depression started in 1929 and remained so until FDR was sworn in January 1933. I'm citing references for that data in the More section below. Yes, I know what you're going to say. Trump cannot be blamed for those job losses caused by the pandemic in 2020 that took the total over his 4-year term well into negative territory. But then you cannot have your cake and eat it too by blaming the problematic inflation numbers from 2021 through early 2023 on Biden. Both the job losses in 2020 under Trump and the problematic inflation numbers for the first 2 years under Biden have a common origin, and that origin is the pandemic. If you want to blame someone or something, blame COVID. Some will say that government deficit spending caused the inflation in 2021 and 2022, but inflation has come down a lot since peaking, even though the annual budget deficit numbers in 2023 were greater than in 2021 and 2022. Republicans will ignore that fact when blaming deficits for the early higher inflation numbers, and will, of course, also ignore how their fiscal and tax policies have aggravated the budget deficits when blaming inflation on the deficits. Consistent thinking is not what they are inclined to do. There are myriad reasons why there were problematic inflation numbers for 2 years, and that was broadly linked to the pandemic. The first has to do with supply chain disruptions that drove up the price of products, and then consumer demand, having been suppressed greatly in 2020 due to the pandemic, spiked as the lockdowns ended, creating major disruptions in the supply-demand equation where demand was far outstripping supply. The Ukraine war added to food and energy inflation. I'm referring to the Russian invasion that started in February 2022. Russia has been responsible for the war in Ukraine starting in 2014. There was also excessive money creation by the Federal Reserve in response to the economic downturn, and this is what the Fed does when there's a major downturn in the economy. The money creation was through the monetary policy known as quantitative easing, where the Fed created money to buy treasuries and mortgage-backed securities that eventually took its balance sheet to over 7 billion, or excuse me, 7 trillion. I wish it was 7 billion. $7 trillion, But that excessive money creation was directly related to the economy going into a downturn that was caused by the pandemic. After ending that aggressive monetary policy known as quantitative easing, the broad measure of money supply called M2 started to decline as the Fed allowed owned securities to mature without reinvesting the proceeds and started to sell them as well. And that unwinding process started turning inflation down as money supply shrunk, or at least the excessive part of the excessive supply shrunk. There may have been less inflation if neither Biden nor Trump had issued stimulus payments, since a sizable number of middle and lower income households would have been unable to purchase products and that would have ameliorated the supply demand imbalance caused by the pandemic and then the resurgence of consumer demand after the lockdowns ended. Those who blame those payments on inflation, and there would be some minor impact, probably have not offered to return their checks yet. If voters wanted to be consistent, then the reasonable conclusion is to not blame Biden for the problematic inflation for 2 years, nor blame Trump for the huge job losses in 2020. Blame COVID, or whoever was responsible for COVID, if anyone was responsible. I think the jury's still out on whether it was man-made or nature-made. Republicans will not do that. They will give Trump a pass on the job losses while blaming Biden for the recession, for the inflation numbers. If Trump had won in 2020 and inflation would have been about the same, they would have blamed the Democrats. That is how it goes and always will go. I'm not saying that the deficits in the annual $1 trillion range are not a big problem. They are going, if you go out far enough into the future. Just not a problem right now. This year, next year, or most likely for years to come, the problem will not be resulting in inflation. Instead, as I've said many times in my blog, that the current level of deficit spending cannot be sustained before it does have a major negative impact on the U.S. economy. The impact will probably not be inflation soaring, but in the Treasury Department being unable to sell enough debt at auction to pay off maturing debt and to fund the then existing current budget deficits, which will be well into the $1 trillion range. I call this event, this type of event, which will occur, and I view it as inevitable now, since both political tribes are fiscally irresponsible, in my opinion, just in different ways. It's failed treasury auctions that will result in the Federal Reserve having to monetize the debt by creating money to buy what cannot be sold. And the volume of what cannot be sold would probably be measured in the trillions. The U.S. government will, in the future, hit a brick wall with funding, with the pedal to the metal going 100 miles per hour. Leading up to that event, investors would be demanding much higher interest rates on Treasury debt, with yields becoming unmoored and eventually totally untethered from current inflation, from the then current inflation and inflation expectations at the time. That would aggravate the deficit financing problem. I am describing in this dire future scenario, a problem that is more of a supply-demand issue, with the supply of treasuries that have to be sold far outstripping the willingness of investors to buy. That may lead to inflation, but the most likely outcome, in my opinion, would be a collapse in the value of the U.S. dollar, a stock market crash, and a depression. But this is not a current and inflation problem, nor will deficit spending cause a problematic inflation in the years to come. The current market forecast of the annual rate of CPI over the next 10 years is about 2%. That is priced in what's called the break-even inflation rate of the 10-year Treasury inflation-protected security. The information that I'm providing here will not cause anyone to change their opinion. The Republicans are going to blame Biden for inflation, but will continue giving Trump a pass on the job losses during his 4 years in office, even though they have a common origin. And they will continue to view the Trump economic numbers with rose-colored glasses that were from 2017 through 2019, while diminishing the numbers over the last 2 years during the Biden administration.